And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing a system here not all that strong, spreading some areas of rain and snow into the southeast coast here. Otherwise, cold high pressure kind of sliding over toward the border up here, still ridging down across all of southern Alaska on out to the west, and southwest winds there bringing some light snow here, very light snow or flurries from about Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, maybe areas of the Arctic coast. Nothing significant there. Dry across the northern Bering Sea. Remnants of this front right through here, just about out of the picture now as this system down to the south pushes northward for tomorrow with rain here, central eastern Aleutians, maybe the western Alaska Peninsula, light rain, a little bit of an increase in the winds there. Clear and cold here across southern Alaska, east side as well, all the way up to the eastern Arctic coast, and increasing snow here for the Arctic coast and locally over the North Slope areas, with continued unsettled conditions for the southeast coast as that weak system pushes down to just west of Prince of Wales Island there, but starting to dry out with increasing northeast winds here for the northern panhandle. And then for the day on Friday, that whole dry pattern shifts southward now as that system breaks up, moves into British Columbia, and that leaving dry conditions with some sunshine there for the southeast coast. Dry continued along the North Gulf Coast, still some gusty outflow winds, Copper River Delta, but nothing too strong. And variable clouds, light winds in the interior, an area of snow pushing to the eastern Arctic coast and then tracking southward, trying to jump the Brooks Range there with some moisture, probably getting hung up in the mountains though. Otherwise, dry on out into the Bering Sea, some showers over the western Aleutians, and some light rain for the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. And for the coastal water forecast here for the south coast of the Panhandle, west to southwest winds at 20 knots for Thursday, north to northeast at 20 to 25 knots, and small craft advisories on the north coast as well for northeast winds, north to northeast winds, 25 to 30 knots. Small craft advisories for the inner channels, Clarence Strait out of the south at 25 knots, north 25 for Stevens Passage, and north winds 30 knots for Lynn Canal. And winds stay up around 30 knots for Lynn Canal on Friday with northeast winds at 25 for Stevens Passage, southeast at 20 for the Clarence Strait area, east at 25 on the south coast. Stronger winds though here on the north coast, central and north coast out of the east and northeast at 30 to maybe 35 knots with seas up to 12 feet. And for Prince William Sound, small craft advisories for the day Thursday, northeast winds 25 knots, seas around 6 feet. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast winds as high as 35 knots with gusts out of the Copper River Delta to 45 knots. And for the west side here, north 20 to 30 knots, north 25 for Barren Islands, gale warnings for Kamishak Bay, northeast winds 35 knots, just under gale force at 30 knots here for southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 20 north of the Forelands. Cook Inlet on Friday, lighter winds here for northern Cook Inlet, north 15, otherwise northeast 25 to the south. Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, both looking at northeast winds at 30 knots. With the North Gulf Coast, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, northeast at 20 for Prince William Sound. Kodiak Island, north to northeast at 25 to 30 knots for Thursday. East to northeast winds 30 to 40 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Those seas up to 12 feet, mostly on the Pacific side, and northeast at 25 knots for Bristol Bay. And for the day on Friday, still pretty windy here for the peninsula. East to northeast winds 30 to 40 knots. Northeast at 25 for Bristol Bay and northeast at 30 for Kodiak Island. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, gale warnings for east to northeast winds 35 to 40 knots. Gales also for Adak and Atka, northeast at 35 knots. And out to the west, northeast 25 here over Amchitka Island, diminished to about 15 to 20 knots from Kiska to Shemya. Then on Friday for the far western Aleutians, actually from about Adak westward, not too bad wind-wise, variable to northeast or east-northeast at 10 to 15 knots. Adak and Atka, east winds, east to northeast winds, 20 knots, and still pretty breezy, but not quite as windy. So looking at some areas of gale force winds for the eastern Aleutians up to 40 knots. And for the southwest coast, east to northeast winds tomorrow at 25 knots. East winds 15 to 25 for Norton Sound and the St. Lawrence Island area. Gale warnings for the Pribilof Islands, east winds 35 knots, seas 15 feet, and east at 25 for St. Matthew Island. And for the day on Friday, small craft advisories for St. Matthew Island and the Pribilofs for east winds 25 to 30 knots. East and northeast winds here for the southwest coast at 20 knots, and east 15 to 20. Norton Sound and the St. Lawrence Island area. And for the Chukchi Sea, we've got south to southeast winds tomorrow at 25 to 40 knots. And brisk wind advisories for the central and western Arctic coast, south to southwest at 25 to 30 knots there, and east-southeast at 15 for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And then for the east side here on Friday, west to northwest winds at 20 knots, and west or northwest 15 to 20 knots central and western Arctic coast, and kind of a variable wind pattern there for the Chukchi Sea from south to east and northeast at 15 to 20 knots.